Welcome to this webinar entitled COVID-19 and HIV, a Clinical Perspective. I'd like to thank all of you for taking time from your usual activities to join us with what I believe will be a very informative, clinically focused session. We'd like to start off by thanking the panelists for giving their time to contribute to this project. And I'd like to thank Gilead Science for providing support so that this webinar could happen. This session will be focused on clinical aspects related to COVID-19. There are many excellent resources related to the psychosocial impact on the HIV community, which can be found on CAHR, and I'd encourage our listeners to go to the CAHR site to assess those. We have a jam-packed agenda, but before we get to that, I'd like to give an opportunity for each of our panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Dr. Sharik Haider.
Thanks very much, Curtis. So my name is Sharik Haider. I'm a professor of medicine here at McMaster University. I'm a practicing internist and infectious disease specialist and the director of HIV care here in Hamilton.
Good, thank you. And Dr. Marissa Becker.
Thanks, Curtis, and hi to everyone. My name is Marissa Becker. I'm an infectious disease physician and associate professor at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, and I am the associate director of the Manitoba HIV program.
And Dr. Alexandra King.
Hello, everybody. I'm Alexandra King from Nipissing First Nation, which is in Ontario. I am an internist and also the chemical chair of Indigenous Health and Wellness at the University of Saskatchewan.
Okay. And Alice Singh.
Hi, I'm Alice Singh. I'm a pharmacist at the Immunodeficiency Clinic at Toronto General Hospital, and I'm an associate professor with the Faculty of Pharmacy at the University of Toronto.
Great. And finally, I'm Dr. Curtis Cooper. I'm an infectious disease specialist and a clinician researcher at the University of Ottawa. And I'll be chairing this session. So welcome everyone, and we will now begin. Starting with the core question, where did this come from? Maybe Marissa can address that question.
Sure, thanks, Curtis. So the first reports were of a novel pneumonia, what we're currently calling COVID-19, and they were from Wuhan, China in December of 2019. Wuhan is in central China and is a major transportation hub and commercial center and has a population of about 11 million people. The virus itself was identified at the end of December, but shortly before that, there were reports of people presenting to hospital with pneumonia of unknown etiology. And it's believed that early cases were acquired infection from a wholesale seafood market in Wuhan. The virus is a zoonotic virus, and it's widely felt that bats are the reservoir, but the intermediate host is not yet identified. And since the early cases in Wuhan, the virus has now spread to over 210 countries and territories. And there have been over 2 million infections globally with 133,000 deaths.
Thanks, that's a great summary. I'll remind our viewers that today is April 15th. And so this is the information as it stands of today, recognizing that the numbers will continue to grow for the foreseeable future. Sharik, what does COVID-19 do to a person?
Thank you, Curtis. So I think we have to start off by recognizing that there is a spectrum of this illness, that the majority of people that present with COVID-19, in fact, are either asymptomatic or in fact have mild presentations. But we do see a spectrum of cases, and for those of us that work in hospital settings, we are seeing the more severe cases come in. But the most common presentation is probably no different than any other viral infection that we see. So about 85 to 90% of the patients will have a fever, particularly more common in adults than children. Nearly 60% of patients will either have a cough, usually it's a non-productive cough, and about 60% of patients will in fact present sometimes with shortness of breath as a presentation. Myalgias and arthralgias that we've seen with common viral infections can be seen, but usually in about 20 to 30% of the patients that come in. It's the severe cases that we worry about. And the severe cases, we'd say that of all the patients that we have been so far worked up as of now worldwide, 20% will end up in an ICU type of setting. And when they end up in an ICU setting, the major complication tends to be this issue of ARDS, or this capillary leak syndrome, which is really the complication that leads to the mortality signal that we're seeing. You may see some complications from a cardiac perspective. That's coming out now, seen in about 10 to 15% of patients, acute kidney injury. And the reason I'm mentioning that is that's the one thing that's different from this particular coronavirus than the previous SARS or MERS, is that there is much greater multi-organ involvement. And I think we'll probably get into some discussion around the reasons behind that to come. And the overall mortality rate for this virus at this point still sits around 13% in the most recent systematic review that was done.
Okay. Alex, why do most people do well and survive, whereas some people get so ill?
Well, there's a lot that we're still learning about coronavirus, and it seems like you're looking at a combination of different factors as to why some people might become much more ill than others. So, as an example, we know that those with underlying health conditions such as cardiovascular disease or diabetes tend to be at increased risk for severe disease. Also, those who are older, and in particular, once you're older than 70 years old, again, it seems like you're at increased risk for severe disease. And if you do become ill, also then increased risk of mortality. There's also other things such as the underlying nutritional status of the person. We know also the environment plays into this. So, access to testing and to care will impact your ability to do well with the virus. And as an example, where you have people who are living in situations where there's overcrowding, they may not have the ability to self isolate. And therefore, not only are they becoming ill, but people around them. The last thing that seems to be happening now, or that we're understanding better, is there seems to also be a dose response. And so, with healthcare workers and frontline service providers that may have greater exposure to people who are sick, and those that they are exposed to tend to have higher viral loads, therefore, there might be increased risk to them. And that's one of the reasons why we are seeing more healthcare workers involved despite your PPEs.
Great, thank you. So, Sherrick, when somebody arrives at the hospital, what are some of the interventions that we can offer people to try and lessen their suffering and keep them from deteriorating?
So thank you, Chris. So I think when our patients do come in, I think at every hospital now, there are standardized protocols and order sets that exist to manage these patients. But when we talk about, obviously, the comfort side of things, it's really about managing their symptoms. So you can manage the fever, the aches and pains. And the recommendation currently is to prefer to use acetaminophen or Tylenol. There was some concern about the use of anti-inflammatories, so that's something to try to stay away from. I think a big part of caring for them, obviously, is also to ensure that we're limiting, obviously, protecting other patients that are in the hospital. So I think all hospitals these days are very trained to the concept of isolation when these patients come in. I think in most cases, the amount of nursing care, wherever possible, is kept to a smaller ratio, so these patients are being closely observed. I can only speak about our own hospital. I sense that it's probably true at other hospitals that for the sicker patients, obviously, who end up being hospitalized, they end up on separate wards. So we actually have a dedicated COVID ward. And clearly there, the number of patients are thankfully still very small and manageable. And there, obviously, there is much closer supervision of these patients, particularly with respect to their respiratory status, which is really the biggest concern of these patients. So we have, obviously, almost one-to-one nursing care in most cases, and shift changes are taking place because it's hard for the nurses because many of them are in PPEs, and for them to spend the amount of direct time that they do for caring for these patients. The same thing applies to the physician providers. I mean, we have very short rotations for physicians who are covering these wards, again, because it is a challenging environment to work in. And then the other thing that we have available for all our patients, I'm sure it's true at other centers, is the opportunity for clinical trials. And we'll get into that, I'm sure, coming up, but those opportunities exist for our patients.
Sure. Can you just comment a little bit on ventilators? When does somebody need to go on that? How many people end up having to go on ventilator support?
So in the literature, as I spoke to earlier, we would say that about 20% of patients end up in the ICU. And of those, again, it is still at present about 35 to 40% that would end up on a ventilator setting. Now, the setting for ventilators as to when you move is happening a bit quicker than we normally will do with other types of illnesses, because one of the issues that we're no longer doing with COVID-19 is the use of non-invasive ventilation. So patients will come in, they'll get a little bit of standard oxygen to see if they can manage with standard oxygen or on venti masks. And usually the next step often is non-invasive ventilation. But here the concern is that with non-invasive ventilation, you can risk spreading the particular virus. So these patients do end up getting intubated a little quicker, not because they necessarily need it from a respiratory perspective, but more to limit that spread or that aerosolization from taking place. So the rates are about 35 to 40% for those that do end up unfortunately within that sort of ICU type of setting.
Yeah. And in my own experience, it seems that once a person is sick enough to be intubated, they often require support for a very long period of time. They're proving to be very difficult to get off the ventilator because it takes a long time for the body to heal itself and get past this severe illness. I just want to remind the viewers that this is not the outcome for most people who are infected with COVID. And it's important to keep in mind that most people do quite well and they survive in good health. So Alice, your turn. There has been a whole slew of medications that have been identified as potentially being active and of use in managing people with COVID. Can you comment on some of these medications and give us an idea as to where we are as far as being sure that they're actually useful?
In terms of the agents that are being investigated for COVID-19 treatment right now, we can think of them in a couple different categories. One are the antiviral agents. There's also many agents that have immune modulating effects that are being investigated, and then other agents which might have additional supportive effects for patients. If we start off looking at antiviral agents, probably say the three main agents getting the most attention right now are hydroxychloroquine, which we know is as an anti-malarial, anti-rheumatic agent, lopinavir, ritonavir, which we're most familiar with from HIV, but also had some previous anecdotal evidence in SARS and MERS, and remdesivir, which is an investigational antiviral agent, also previously thought to have some activity in some other coronaviruses, and it's currently under active study. To date, there's been really just a handful of reports, some possibly showing some interesting observations. I think it's still very early to make any definitive conclusions about whether these agents are effective in improving clinical outcomes, clinical course of COVID-19 illness. But as we know, these studies are ongoing. There are also a number of immunomodulating agents that are being studied. For instance, agents such as sarilumab or tocilizumab, which are anti-IL-6 receptor agents. And those are I guess the hypothesis is to look at whether these can help modulate some of the immune responses in severe COVID illness.
Good, thank you. It's as you suggested, there's a lot of ground to cover. Ribavirin is being used, colchicine has been considered. The list goes on and on. Sherrick, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the use of immunoglobulin to treat these patients.
So thank you, Curtis. So there is obviously lots of interest around the potential use of sort of passive immunization using convalescent sort of plasma samples from recovered patients, which is separate from particularly IVIG-mediated immune globulin therapy. So IVIG therapy really hasn't shown to be terribly effective. But there is currently a multi-center Canadian study that's about to be launched about this concept of using convalescent plasma as immune-based therapy. Obviously, early days, and we're going to have to wait to get some results back to see how effective this is. Just as was said for the other antiviral agents, there is very preliminary data that's out with this type of passive immunization, and it'd be very hard to make any meaningful conclusions at this time. So we just have to wait for these trials to be completed.
This is the question for the whole group, and I don't really think there is a correct answer, but should we be using any of these medications in the patients that we're seeing in a case-by-case basis, or should we be saying that none of these are proven and that we shouldn't expose people to the potential risk? Maybe Marissa, you can start us off with your thoughts on that.
Sure, thanks, Curtis. I think it's an important question. It's a big question, and as you said, I don't know that there is a correct answer to it. I think that during the course of the pandemic, when people are coming in quite sick to hospital and have very severe disease, providers are in a position where they're looking to see what they can do to help patients. And I think that we don't have time to wait until we get all the answers in, and that's why we're seeing the use of some of these medications that we have some familiarity with or have some preliminary evidence with. But it is decided, I think, on a case by case basis based on the individual that you have in front of you and their situation.
Great, thanks. Now, Alexandra, do you have a similar perspective on this or different?
No, I think that Marissa has really summarized this quite nicely. And I think also that we have to recognize the lack of evidence that exists right now. And so we really are in the process of trying to do the best that we can.
Okay, good. So lots of talk about vaccinations as being the ultimate aim at trying to put a stop to the COVID epidemic. Sherrick, can you talk a little bit about where we're at with COVID specific vaccines?
Thank you, Curtis. And as you said, there is lots of interest around the topic of vaccine development. I think on the positive side, we can say that in the context of this pandemic, we have seen a lot of novel viral development platforms that have come along. And the last time that I looked in early April, there were almost 115 potential candidates for vaccine development. Now, most of these are at the very early exploratory stage, but we have about 5 candidates that are actually in the preclinical phase 1 stage. I think the challenge everybody knows with vaccine development is the problem of going from conception design to clinical implementation. And I know that from our past experiences with SARS and even in fact with Ebola, that same challenge exists. Having said that, I think that there is a real collaborative sense about getting an effective vaccine out. And so I think on the promising side, I think we're going to, I think this is something we have to be committed to. The 5 clinical, sort of preclinical molecule vaccine candidates that are out there include a DNA-based vaccine, an RNA-based vaccine, a viral vector-based vaccine that's out there. So I think we're just going to have to stay tuned, but obviously lots of interest around vaccine development.
Yeah, very promising, but also not without risk. It is within the realm of possibility that a vaccine could actually make things worse. So I know we're all keen to get a vaccine as quickly as possible and get it out into the population, but it is important to do this safely and very carefully so that we have a vaccine that works and doesn't make things worse. So now we're going to spend a little bit of time focusing on some of the HIV specific questions that we all have. And starting us off, we'll ask Alex, are people living with HIV and AIDS at more risk of infection, serious illness, and death because of this?
Well, as I've said before, and others as well, there's a lot about COVID-19 that we don't understand. However, right now, the best guidance that is out there is that if somebody has HIV and it's well managed, and so the viral load is suppressed, immune reconstituted, they do not appear to be at increased risk for COVID. That being said, we do know that if somebody is not well managed, their immune system is not functioning as well, and therefore they are likely at increased risk. Additionally, in some of our population that are experiencing HIV and aging, they have comorbid diseases. And so therefore, if in fact they were to be getting COVID-19, they may be at increased risk for more severe disease.
Great. Thanks for that great response. Alice, you mentioned that Kaletra, an HIV medication, is currently being considered as a therapeutic agent for COVID. Does this mean that people on antiretroviral therapy are protected from COVID?
Thanks, Curtis. That's a really good question. It's interesting if you look at the story of lopinavir, ritonavir, and how it's come to be considered an agent in this illness, and it's based on the fact that it has some in vitro activity against COVID-19. Whether or not this actually plays out into being an effective treatment, I mean, we're definitely not recommending at this point that everyone switch over their HIV therapies to ritonavir by any means. I know there was some earlier interest in another protease inhibitor, darunavir, because there was some hope that it might also have some activity against the SARS-CoV-2 virus, but that has not really played out. And as far as I'm aware, the manufacturer has pulled this drug from further study for this indication. Now, there are some interesting papers that are now coming out suggesting that there might be other drugs out there. I know remdesivir, which was the experimental antiviral that I mentioned earlier, is structurally similar to tenofovir. I know there was a paper that just came out suggesting that some of these agents may have some activity against the SARS-CoV-2. So, making a huge leap, does that mean that something like tenofovir will be helpful? I think it's something worth exploring. But at this point, I think the main message is really, as Alexandra mentioned before, people should be staying on their HIV medications to keep their own viral load suppressed and to maintain their health. And that's probably the single most important thing.
Okay, thanks for that. And I just want to echo what's already been suggested, that at this time, the data is very weak that any of these antiretrovirals have any benefit at all, and really want to caution against making any changes in your current antiretroviral therapy. Marissa, this is proven to be a very challenging time to continue to see our patients living with HIV in clinic. Can you comment on what you're doing and what your colleagues are doing to try and make sure that those connections are maintained?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think our patients are on the forefronts of all of our minds right now. And while the situation's not optimal, I think people are really doing the best they can, both in terms of providers as well as patients alike. In Manitoba, what we've done is our clinics have really reduced the number of patients that we're seeing through our clinics. And what we're doing instead is moving to triaging patients over the phone and conducting phone visits for the most part for individuals that are stable. Individuals that require urgent clinical assessment and anyone that's newly diagnosed with HIV, we are still seeing through our clinics as we're able to for now. And what we've also done is adjusted our normal follow-up schedule. So people that are stable on meds, doing well, suppressed, we're reducing the frequency of diagnostic testing, at least for now, until our labs and the capacity normalize or resume to the normal processes again. I think that individuals are appreciative of phone calls and touching base. It's a way to stay connected to our patients and for patients to feel that they're connected to us. And it's also an opportunity to reinforce the messaging around prevention for COVID and to also encourage patients to maintain their optimal health, including adherence to antiretroviral medications, as we've heard earlier in the webinar. That's really so important just in terms of people living with HIV staying well. for those individuals that are not clinically stable and have not been able to maintain a suppressed viral load, we're seeing them in clinic as we're able to, and coordinating with our community-based site as well. I think some of the challenges, though, that we're facing that are important to note is that with large numbers of people being unemployed and with some of the economic hardships that we're seeing, individuals are increasingly unable to afford their medication deductibles. And that's an issue for us here in Manitoba, and one in terms of that we're exploring options and to try to work with our patients to make sure that they've got uninterrupted medication supply.
Thanks. And in conversation with our colleagues across the country, your description of how we're trying to address this need is quite similar. So I found that patients are very grateful to know that our HIV clinics are still there for them and still reaching out to make sure that they know we haven't forgotten about them. Now, we're all very concerned about some key populations, including the Indigenous population, and some of the stories we're hearing about how the Black population is suffering down in the States is very, very concerning. Alexandra, do you have any thoughts on how this is impacting those two populations?
Well, in terms of Indigenous people, we know that we are experiencing increased underlying health determinant challenges, and this ranges from socioeconomic status to living in areas where we don't have as good access to health care, so I think that. And you combine it with intersectionality. There's many Indigenous people who may have multiple health conditions, and so therefore they're trying to manage that as well as perhaps HIV. And it doesn't seem to matter whether or not you're rural or urban. There's increased representation of Indigenous people amongst that group that Marissa was mentioning, who are maybe not as clinically stable as we would like. And so therefore it becomes even more important for us to be reaching out and trying to help them manage their HIV and other conditions even more. One of the things that I think is interesting is Marissa has mentioned how we are increasingly relying on telemedicine or telephones and so on to be reaching our patients. But of course, that assumes that they have phones or have plans and so on. And so I think that we're having to be really quite innovative with getting communications to patients and with patients. We've also heard about possible interruptions, and one of the big concerns is that several of the provinces have gone to the point that they're only filling 1 month at a time for prescriptions. And so again, that can result in increased treatment interruptions, and particularly if you're in more rural, remote areas and depending on where you're getting your medications from. That being said, even though there are many increased challenges that Indigenous people face, I think that the resilience and strength that I'm also hearing about is quite remarkable. For example, we've had communities that are setting up roadblocks in order to stop outsiders from coming in and making sure that only essential personnel are coming into the communities. There's been increased hunting that is going on to deal with food insecurities in some of our more rural and remote communities. Virtual powwows as ways of connecting and keeping strong communities and support for each other. And so I think that with the Indigenous community, you have both the increased challenges because of health determinants and increased comorbidities, but also a lot of strength and a lot of resilience.
Thank you for that. Sherrick, can you comment a little bit more about some of the concerning reports coming from the States about the African Caribbean Black population and the increased morbidity and mortality?
Yes, thank you, Curtis. So I think that has been a real wake-up call, I think, certainly south of the border, but I think it applies here as well. I think it's really highlighted, and we've heard that from Marissa and Alex about the almost the economic divide that exists within our countries. We're seeing the effects of poor socioeconomic status and how it's impacted our African Caribbean communities, both south of the border and certainly here. I think Alex makes a very important point that if you recognize that in the ACV population, comorbidities are significantly more common: high blood pressure, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and those are the really important factors that have been linked to the severe cases that we're seeing for COVID-19. And then to add to that is obviously the social challenges of not being able to socially distance yourself when you're living in areas with high density living conditions, close contacts. That obviously leads to unfortunately outbreaks that are going to happen, and the ability to follow these public health recommendations become increasingly more challenging, I think, for our ACB communities. At a clinic level, much like what you've heard from Alex and Marissa, we're doing exactly the same things here in Ontario. We're trying to obviously be as supportive as we can for our patients, but it is their resilience really that's carrying them forward. We're using a lot of telemedicine. OTN is a network that I know you're familiar with, Curtis, that we use here a lot. And we started, every physician has signed up for it at our clinic now and is using it. And I also wanted to echo that remark that it's amazing how receptive the patients are and how grateful they have been for the accommodation that we've carried forward. But I think our ACB population clearly needs to be focused on. And I think it's a reminder for us that this issue of comorbidities is something that we need to do a better job at, in addition to our primary HIV responsibilities.
So thank you, everyone, for your thoughts. We're going to move into the final segment of our discussion. Now, recognizing that CAHR is a research organization, I think it's important to consider some of the ramifications of COVID on HIV research. So, Sherrick, I'll ask you first. What has been and what will be the impact on HIV research in Canada?
Thank you, Curtis, for that question. I think clearly it's at the forefront of all the HIV researchers in Canada. I think we're all going to agree that at this point, clearly research has to be driven towards the pandemic and focused in on the pandemic. And I think it's probably time to recognize that the government has done quite a bit. We have over $52 million that have been contributed towards pandemic research. I think and I'm sure other HIV researchers just need to make sure that some, if not a fair bit of that funding still looks at the intersection between this particular pandemic virus and HIV, its social impacts. I think those are the important questions that we can still maintain.
So, Marissa, can you comment on the impact that the COVID pandemic is having on research on a global level?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Curtis. And I think similar to what Sherrick was sharing, I think it's most definitely having an impact. A lot of researchers are turning their attention to COVID as need be. And obviously that's utmost priority. And funders are also doing the same. And so it creates a shift for sure. But I think we can see it from a positive lens as well. A lot of work is going into vaccine and drug development, and that knowledge can potentially help not only the management of COVID, but other infectious diseases. And we're also seeing a really rapid response from both granting agencies as well as industries to put calls out for COVID research. And I think going forward, those processes and systems can be applied to other public health issues, including to HIV, as the needs arise. And I think the other thing that it's doing is that COVID is really bringing together researchers from around the world. It's creating platforms and networks to facilitate research in different contexts, to catalyze current work and to build on work that's already happening. And that's really positive. And I think hopefully that can be sustained going forward. I think the field of HIV also has a lot to offer in how we're addressing COVID, and researchers within the field of HIV can contribute to that. There was a publication that just came out from UNAIDS not that long ago that looked at lessons from HIV for an effective response. And it listed 7 steps that I think are really quite applicable to the COVID response. So it talked about engaging communities, combating stigma, testing, helping people protect themselves, clarifying evidence-based restrictions, country cooperation, and the need to support and protect health workers. Those are really important principles and approaches and that have been taken from the HIV experiences and have leveraged the HIV expertise and are most definitely translatable to the pandemic situation we're in.
Great, thank you. Now, next question is, what's happening in the Canadian HIV research community to address this? And from my own involvement with the Canadian HIV Trials Network, I've seen that group mobilize their resources to assist with the analyses of ongoing COVID studies. Alex, can you tell us a little bit more about what some of our colleagues in the Canadian HIV research community are up to?
Well, I know that we had a little bit of a side conversation about this, and it seems that there are various ones of us involved in different studies that are going on, and where we can, we're bringing up the HIV lens to the research that is happening. I think also that there are opportunities for us to be advocating and using some of these opportunities for advocacy. So, as an example, here in Saskatchewan, the Saskatchewan Health Research Foundation has launched an opportunity which is more to do with knowledge translation and exchange. So, how do we get COVID messaging to particular communities? But it can also be how we could get the needs of our particular communities known as well. So I think that you have a combination of different things. My husband was actually a basic researcher in mucociliary transport, and he's part of a team that is looking at how we can reduce airborne transmission through more effective personal protective equipment. And so I'm being involved with that from a clinical perspective. It'd be really interesting if a few other people could comment on some of the research that they're undertaking or involved with.
Sure.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, so certainly locally, I have been fairly involved in a number of our trials that are taking place. And I'm going to mention a couple of them as they are multi-center trials that are taking place. The one is actually called the ACT trial, the anti-COVID trial. And this is actually a factorial design that's being looked at both for outpatients and inpatients. And we'll have three separate arms. Chloroquine plus zithromax is going to be one of those arms. Interferon beta alone is going to be one of those arms, and obviously standard of care. I'm also involved in a recent study out of London, Ontario, which I think is going to be of interest to our HIV research group. I think this is a translational study that's looking at the idea of looking at immunocompromised hosts. And there are about four categories. One will include HIV infected patients. The other will be transplants, solid organ transplants, allo transplants, and then actually patients with rheumatological disorders. And the idea really is to look at the immunological milieu of this patient group. And it goes back to that discussion earlier on by Alice about the use of agents like tocilizumab. The reality is that we don't know what type of IL-6 type responses do we see in this particular subgroups of patients. And if anything, we know that sometimes that immune response is in fact dampened in these subgroups. So this is a translational study with some clinical endpoints. So we're starting off with London. I think there's 2 or 3 centers in London, our center here in Hamilton. And we're going to start it as a pilot. As we build it, we may expand that to other centers. So that's just a couple of examples.
Alice, anything happening in Toronto?
Our center is involved in a number of studies, both looking at antiviral and or immunomodulatory agents for treating severe COVID illness in hospitalized patients. So I guess I'm bringing my pharmacology, drug interaction sort of lens to make sure that patients are enrolled safely into the study. I think there's also a number of PrEP studies that are up and coming using different agents, which I think is of great interest. So that's something that I think also will bear looking at. And finally, I think it's quite rare, which is great, but I think we should also be, try and be cognizant and advocate for our patients and participate if need be in as many studies as possible. And hopefully, HIV should not be an exclusion criteria for participating in a study, unless, say it's with a single HIV agent. But other than that, it really shouldn't be an exclusionary criteria. So I think that's something that we can all be aware of and advocate for.
Yeah, it's a really important point. Thanks for bringing that up, Alice. Marissa, what's happening in Winnipeg?
Manitoba is also participating in some of the multi-site trials that have been mentioned, and there are a number of researchers contributing to that. And so those include the PrEP trials, among others. There also is a trial that's being led by a researcher in Manitoba looking at post-exposure prophylaxis for household contacts and exposed healthcare workers as well.
Lots of activity in Ottawa as well. I'm involved with a group developing a serologic test, which will be very important in identifying people who've already been infected with COVID. And this will be important in getting people out of isolation and back into the workforce and back into more social environments. There's studies looking at a multitude of these medications. We're a CATCO site, so that study just got initiated today in Ottawa. And hopefully this is going to give us the kind of high quality data from randomized clinical trials that we need going forward, so that we're not just guessing what medications might be helping people recover from COVID infection, but it'll give us information so that we know which meds to use and which ones to abandon. So this brings us to our final question. How do you see the COVID-19 pandemic changing medical practice?
Well, I'm an optimist, so I'm going to go with for the better. I think that certainly this is going to strengthen our public health surveillance and response systems within the country as well as between countries. And I think that the pandemic presents an opportunity to learn about what's worked well in some settings, both in terms of prevention as well as care. And I think it also highlights some of the deficits in our system. In terms of prevention, I think everyone around the world now knows what an epidemic curve looks like. I think that new treatments are being developed that potentially have broader applications. New diagnostics are being developed, including a lot of point of care diagnostics that will definitely be applicable to other public health conditions and issues as they arrive. And I think these situations really push us to be more creative as a field and innovative as a field. And I think importantly, bring us closer together and emphasize how we have to look after one another. So I'm optimistic and hopeful that it'll continue to strengthen the care we can provide for our patients.
Good. Alexandra.
I'm an optimist, and so I'm hoping that this will strengthen our approaches as we move forward. I think that we have had to become more creative, and that the innovation is just going to be continuing. And therefore, it will be incumbent on us to be learning from that and bringing that forward once we're beyond COVID.
Great, thanks. Alice.
I agree. I think even though it seems like it's a really sort of tough and challenging and very hectic time right now, I think it's pretty amazing to see all the efforts coming through, and I think a lot of the things that are learned from this experience will be really valuable going forward. So. Keeping my fingers crossed.
Yeah. Sherrick?
I have the easiest job because I get to agree with all my colleagues. Entirely echo the sentiment that, I think I'm an optimist as well. And I think challenges bring the best out of people. And I think one of the things from frontline medicine, I think that we're going to see is just this whole idea of telemedicine. And I think that's something that's good for our patients. I think I know many of our clinics are centrally based in major centers. We have patients that come and travel. I think this will be a bit of a wake-up call for us to say, can we do the same level of care with supportive telemedicine? It's just a small example of a positive thing coming out of this experience.
I think we're getting a lot more experience and learning a lot more about managing people who are in the ICU and are in septic shock and who are ventilator dependent. And I think the knowledge learned through the study of COVID is going to be very valuable in improving survival for all patients going forward who end up in the ICU. So that could be one of the very positive, beneficial outcomes that I hope we'll see. I think as far as lessons learned that I really hope we learn well this time around is that it's critical to protect our public health infrastructure and our microbiology capacity. And there's a tendency when things are good to start stripping these down because it seems like it's an excess use of money. But this should be an abundant lesson to us that if you strip down your public health capacity, you will suffer when times get tough, like the period that we're currently going through. So, this brings us to the end of our webcast. I'd like to thank each of our panelists for your fantastic contribution to the discussion. I'd like to thank Gilead for their support for this session. I'd like to once again recognize and thank the CAHR team for conceptualizing this idea and putting it into action. And I thank all of you for joining us today. I hope you found this of value, informative, and we wish you all the best and hope that you can stay safe during this challenging time. Thank you.